Chapter 5: Social Reform in the Progressive Era. Evaluating the limited nature of progressive social reform. Progressives were trying to make changes in many areas which diluted the success they had. Many labor unions were unorganized and only had specifically skilled workers to rally. This led to rivalry between craft unions and factories. Unlike most other groups in the Progressive Era, women's organizations were numerous and well organized. Women were able to obtain legislation passed by the Supreme Court that was not passed for men. Early immigration in the U.S. In 1914, in a population of 92 million people, 21 million consisted of immigrants. Immigrants lived in separate communities. In 12 of the largest cities, 40% of the population was made of immigrants, with 20% also being second-generation descendants. In the Progressive Era, 60% of the workforce was made up of immigrants. Most immigrants lived in impoverished communities. Many times, immigrant families had to separate in order to support themselves due to a combination of poor living situations, high-risk jobs, and a lack of social policies. At the start of the Progressive Era, there were no social programs or policies we see as essential in today's society. Some examples of this would be SNAP or minimum wage. In 1893, the Depression changed the general public's favor toward corporations. Social reform grew out of inspiration from the public to regulate these corporations. In the beginning of the Progressive Era, they focused their attention to reform environmental issues. Some examples of this would be overcrowding, tenements, and poor working conditions. The Progressives realized that America led by giving opportunity to its citizens, but lacked by not being able to provide security. Reform and progressive measures at this time were supported by the public due to the corruption they saw and read about. Some examples of this would be dangerous working conditions, political corruption, and children placed in adult prisons. The Progressive Era established countless regulations during this time. Limited social programs of the Progressive Era. Social programs focused on in the Progressive Era were working compensation, mother's pension, juvenile court, children's bureau, and protections for female workers in various states. Policy reforms for women. Reform policy allowed single mothers to receive pensions to help them take care of their family. Problems. Very little money was given out, very few received it, and it always maintained a long waiting list, and immigrants rarely ever received any help. Policy reform for children. Establishment of a juvenile court system in order to keep children out of adult trials and prisons. The National Children's Bureau was originated in 1904. They fought for child labor laws but were shut down by the Supreme Court. Policy reforms for workers. Beginning of the establishment of workmen's comp. It was in most states by the 1920s but was very low wages. Policy reforms for persons with mental illness. The Progressive Era introduced services for people who were released from mental institutions. Health reforms in a flawed capitalist model. The Progressive Era created many major health reforms. Public health centers were established. Public health inspectors were hired to enforce sanitation regulations. The Progressive Era also explored public health care systems financed by the government rather than patients themselves. Oppression of vulnerable groups in the Progressive Era. Oppression of women. Anti-suffrage organizations argued that women voters would destroy the household by voting for their own interests. To counteract this, suffragettes argued female voters would support progressive reform on education and family issues. Women were mostly assigned to childbearing and domestic duties during the Progressive Era, and most were not taken seriously when nominated for administrative positions. Oppression of African Americans. Most African Americans were paid very poorly for intense labor jobs. Many jobs and payments were better in the North than the South, but were still very deficient. Many of the neighborhoods African Americans lived in were worse than immigrant neighborhoods, meaning there were very low health conditions and health services. Many African American women fought for education, seeing that it was their way out of poverty, but were oppressed by poor education systems. Oppression of Asian immigrants and Spanish-speaking persons. Asian immigrants were viewed as sinister and untrustworthy by Americans. Due to this, many were not given job opportunities. Many Asian immigrants turned their knowledge of farming on hillsides and irrigation to make a living off the land in California. Many Spanish-speaking persons were paid low wages, denied educational opportunities, and economic opportunities. Their sojourner mentality allowed them to retain their culture even through oppression. Emergence of social work. Social work was first developed to help immigrants, poor people, and children who could not stay with their families. The National Conference of Charities was founded in 1897 and was considered forerunners of the social work profession. During the Progressive Era, case work began to emerge. At this time, social work was focused mostly on helping people in poverty. What can we learn from the Progressive Era? From the Progressive Era, we have learned that social science and policy advocacy have a relationship, and in order to achieve policy reform, both organizations and data are needed. We also learned from the failures of the Progressive Era that it is important to have federal direction and resources. We can learn and be inspired by the attitudes and urgency that the Progressive Era had to create regulations in many places for all Americans to have a better life.